Hello, David. Good morning.
Hello,
There you
Skip.
are.
Yeah, it's yeah. Good morning to you. Here it's a little later, but it's
Yes, it's 8 o'clock
in the morrow.
just a minute. I have a bit of a problem right now because if I listen, I've got to change my sound here because I'm hearing. Let's see if I do that. Maybe that'll help. I'm hearing myself both on YouTube and on
Okay. Yeah.
Zoom, so I have to correct that.
Start. It starts now.
Just a moment. Are you hearing it twice?
No.
Okay, I'm here. I was hearing it twice. So let me just see if that. No. All right. Very irritating. That didn't solve it. All right, one more test. Is this, are you hearing me now, David?
I'm hearing you fine.
Okay, let's just see what happens because YouTube is on like a 30-second delay. And so then I get this playback from YouTube into my ears as I'm trying to talk to you. Okay, and here are a couple more guests. And so let me get them aboard. And
good morning.
Good morning. It seems I've solved my sound problem. So it was good. I had it.
Good morning, David.
How are you?
Gave you folks
it's the one that's been
to join.
One been plaguing the last couple of weeks with the mic, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's just too confusing because I have three outputs for sound on my computer. So I have three different headsets. And
oh, okay.
And the question is, how do I know which one I should have plugged in? And
the too many oral options of
right.
AUR year.
Yeah, and it keeps changing, but now I seem to have solved my problem. So, and this has given a few people to join, time for a few people to join us on YouTube, including Nick. So hi, Nick.
Nick, hey, you on?
And hello, Yuan. Welcome. All right, so I have a couple of things that I want to do today. And I'm going to finish up with Dr. Ferrer's book. But before I do that, by synchronicity, my friend Tim Holmes had sent me a book that has, which is this book, and it's what it actually is records of the Congress, a congressional record, and it's eulogies of three congressmen that have been printed here, and they're quite beautiful eulogies, but these gentlemen who wrote these eulogies, and the book was published in 1909, so it was 11 years before women had the vote, let alone could serve in Congress. So there were only men. It was a boys' club at that time in Congress, and they pulled from various useful sources. And so it seems to me I'm going to begin and end today's session with passages from this book. And Tim, for those of you who don't know, online, Tim gave me this book. It's falling apart, and
Good quality to use.
however, I've taped it up now so that it'll hold together. But in the front of it, he's put this drawing and changed the name to Storm Stories, a Cautionary Tale. And then he's included various drawings within the piece, within the book. And so it has taken the art of the orator and turned it into the art of the artist. And now I'm turning it into the art of a Jungian psychologist, sort of. I'm not a Jungian psychologist, but the point is that it's a collaborative work of art. And so one of these guys said this, and since it comes from the ancients and it relates to our current time, I think it might be useful. And I'm reading from the address of Mr. Hawley of Oregon. And so here's what part of what Mr. Hawley said. In thinking of him, I think of the advice that Polonius gave to Laertius, quote, "Give thy thoughts no tongue, nor any unproportioned thought his act. Be thou familiar, but by no means vulgar. The friends thou hast, and their adoption tried, grapple them to thy soul with hoops of steel. But do not dull thy palm with entertainment of each new hatched, unfledged comrade. Beware of entrance to a quarrel, but being in, bear it that the opposed may beware of thee. Give every man thine ear, but few thy voice. Take each man's censure, but reserve thy judgment. This above all, to thine own self be true. And it must follow, as the night the day, that thou canst not then be false to any man." Okay, so that's a cautionary piece of advice from Polonius to Laertius from ancient times, and it certainly applies to the last week. So good morning.
Yeah, definitely.
It's 8:10 in the East. Do you know where your children are?
They're not giving thoughts to the tongue, not giving tongue to the thoughts.
Right. And so David has joined us from Paris. Welcome, David. And I'm working with Jorge and Ferrer's. I hope I'm pronouncing his name properly. I try to pretend that I can pronounce a European name, but I cannot. Maybe David could help me. Ferrer. How would you say that? It's Spanish.
Ferrer. In Spanish,
Ferrer.
Ferrer. Yeah.
Okay. So Jorge, maybe I'm just stretching it out a little bit. Ferrer, like that. Okay. So, and Dr. Ferrer will be appearing with us on February the 7th at this hour, or I'm sorry, at 1 p.m. To talk about this book and the changes he's made to his thinking. This book that I'm working with is a 2002 book, but he wrote another book which came out in 2017. I'll just show that. It's called Participation and the Mystery, and it's transpersonal essays on psychology, education, and religion. And this was my wife's headlines when we were having a session on Friday or on last Wednesday, and all of a sudden there was breaking news. So All right. So going back, I'm just going to read through the 4 points that Dr. Ferrer makes at the end of the book, and then read his 2-page conclusion, but sentence by sentence. But first of all, the summation. A more relaxed spiritual universalism as the topic, as the headline. In this book, I have introduced a participatory spiritual pluralism as a more adequate metaphysical framework than the perennialism typical of most transpersonal works. If I have argued so forcefully for spiritual pluralism, it is because, 1, a naive and rigid universalism has been generally taken for granted in transpersonal studies. 2, I believe that pluralism should be the starting point of interfaith inquiry and dialogue. 3, pluralism is more consistent with my own participatory understanding of spiritual states of discernment. And 4, conceiving a plurality of spiritual liberation and ultimates not only is more generous and recognizing, but also can foster the infinite creativity of the spirit. Although for these and other reasons, my work emphasizes the metaphysical plurality of spiritual worlds, I should stress here that I do not believe that either pluralism or universalism per se are spiritually superior or more evolved. And it is now time to make explicit the kind of spiritual universalism implicit in the participatory vision. Now, the one thing I want to draw everybody's attention to from that paragraph is that we've had ecumenical meetings for 100 years, probably at least, and everybody's gotten together. The priest, the rabbi, the pastor, the mullah have gotten together for lunches and breakfasts around the world, probably for a long, long time, and they talk about their, what they have in common. But in my view, they leave those meetings believing that they were right. They're right. Their approach is right, and the other approaches are not the best approach. I think that's the best way to put it. And so what Dr. Ferrer is doing is he's turning that on its head and saying they're all right. Okay, and there's none that's better than any of the others. It's just they're different, and so that's where we are. So that was the summation, and so now I'll read on here. There is a way, I believe, in which we can legitimately talk about a shared spiritual power, one reality, one world, or one truth. On the one hand, the discussion about whether there is one world or a multiplicity of different worlds can be seen as ultimately a semantic one and metaphysically a pseudo problem. Okay, so what he's saying here is that it's just how you talk about it. Semantic refers to how you talk about something, right? And it's a pseudo problem, and it's a pseudo problem that at least for the last 2,000 years that we can point to, religions, which are structures of the metaphysical, have all claimed that they're right and the others are wrong. And the result of that is that millions of human beings around the world have been killed because they don't believe the way you believe. And what he's saying is, there's nothing to that in truth.
Right.
So any comments there before I go on?
I particularly enjoy the fact that he is finally in that way, dispensing with the melting pot, and is moving back to more Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks and the dignity of difference. And rather than tribalism, he is making allusions to community, but so that the tribes maintain their cultures and develop their cultures, though they share their cultures, but not muddy themselves to blend. There's overlappages, but to keep those things that, as I guess Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks would say, I mean, their dignity of difference, the integrity of their identity culturally. And that to me is of chief importance.
Right on. Okay, and thank you for our YouTube followers for being here this morning. We're having some nice comments here, but going on. All right, so it's a pseudo problem, and I think you raised some good points there, Jordan. So on the other hand, a shared spiritual ground needs to be presupposed to make interreligious inquiry and dialogue possible and intelligible. So what he's saying is it's a shared spiritual ground. Everybody has good ideas. And, for example, Muslims pray 5 times a day. Well, what could be wrong with that? In one sense, and I have spent a lot of time in Saudi Arabia now. And so in one sense, at the beginning of that, I made 23 trips there over a 10-year period. At the beginning, I thought it was kind of interesting that these business leaders and leaders of hospitals and so on would be in the middle of a very serious meeting about very serious topics like bird flu or something like that. And all of a sudden, the time for prayer would come, and there'd be the call for prayer, and they'd just stop and walk out and said, "I have to pray. I'll be back." And so then they went out to pray. And at first, it seemed kind of odd to me that they would do that in the middle of an important business meeting. But on the other hand, I came to really appreciate that time out and the ability to just reflect myself, and whether it was reflecting on God or reflecting on what was being said in the meeting, I don't recall anymore, but I really respected it, and so I wouldn't mind if we made that a rule. I mean, one Buddhist that I heard of, he was asked, "When do you meditate?" And the Buddhist priest said, "I'm always meditating." And I think I've come to the conclusion that that's more or less where I am too. In other words, I consciously try to connect myself up with myself in the Jungian context, with my deep unconscious, the greater personality, and I consciously try to connect myself up with that first thing in the morning, and I try not to leave that state throughout the day. And so when I'm here, I follow the rule of Ernest Hemingway, who was asked, "How do you write a novel?" And he says, "I open a vein and I bleed." Okay. And that's exactly how I run this Sunday morning session, which is I have no idea what I've said a minute ago, and I have no idea what I will be saying a minute from now, but I'm just running my mouth and people seem to like it. So,
well, and your prayer, prayer 5 times a day, speaks to that. Do not dull thy hand with entertainment, as it's basically an extension of no idle hands, or idle hands are the mother of. So there's a piece there where the discipline of the ritual, simply having that structure, is you're already halfway there, because it's a walking meditation, so to speak, of you are praying, and that's all need happen. And this, just like this, your discipline of the ritual is to stay the course. And as you do, then you can come up out of, move from the side, open and close. But you're giving it that common foundation, or common ground that he indicated.
Well, and I do have a common ground. So the
Right.
other day, as you observed, Jordan was there, but others weren't, that when my wife came in with the breaking news and gave me the headlines to read to the group, most people in the group were just freaking out, and never occurred to me to freak out. I mean, some members of the group were worried that the army was going to come out and support Trump, and it would be a coup d'etat, and that would be the end of America and all that. And I said, no, they won't. They're not going to do that. And that was coming from a deep place, because I've spent the last 74 years in the U.S. military. I still carry an active ID card for the military, and I get my haircuts at the Navy base, and I don't get there frequently enough, but in any case, I knew that there wouldn't be U.S. Army regulars or Marines coming to the aid of Donald Trump, and his problem was that he doesn't know that. Okay.
Well, and I resonate that you shared that, because my thought was Sun Tzu, and I don't want to play any us versus them with the specific words of this quote, but they apply just to that of never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. You just let it run. You let it run all the way through. Don't do most of your job for you. It's like, and as then we see the way it enacted start to finish, it seemed calm on the news, and you could tell that inside it wasn't, and we weren't seeing everything. So just that, never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake was, I'm like, here we go.
Well, and it remains to be seen whether any disruption is actually going to happen on January 17th or 20th, because I remember when the Charlottesville event occurred, and we had a couple of hundred wannabe Nazis running around with tiki torches that they bought at Home Depot.
Which that was, I have to say, that was hilarious.
It was hilarious at the time.
It was like the Onion staged a protest.
But Trump had the idea that these sorts of things would happen all over the country. And I recall that the following Sunday, or Saturday or Sunday, there was supposed to be a demonstration like that in Boston, and there was a counter crowd that formed in Boston Common, I believe, but the Tiki Torch crowd came, and there were only 23 of them, and they saw the counter crowd, and they just evaporated. They left, and they never gave a single speech. And I wouldn't be at all surprised to see that happen again, because guys who fly in from South Dakota, let's say, to attack the U.S. Capitol have no clue that there are no means of ingress and egress in the Washington area, and if they do that, they're going to be captured and thrown in jail, and they're going to be tried, and they're going to spend some timeout time, courtesy of Uncle Sugar. 3 odds and a god. Okay, so going on.
Well, and that actually right there, I think, speaks into that third point. Give every man thy ear, but not every man thy voice. There's just the discretion of, again, I'm going to hang back and I'm going to let you go ahead and finish this mistake because, wow, you just can't make this stuff up.
Right. So it remains to be seen whether any of these jokers are going to fly in. They're going to fly into Reagan National Airport. They're going to attack the Capitol, and then they think they're going to fly out again with their AR-15s or something.
Right. It's a charter terrorism. Is that what it is? It's like you charter your bus to the.
Right. I mean, it's just laughable. This president has been such a bad joke for 4 years. And
if I may ask David, because you've got the perspective across the Atlantic pond, how have you seen, what is the reaction or the response there?
Well, I mean, except for Emmanuel Macron, excuse me, the president who spoke the next morning. Though I didn't listen to his speech because I tend not to listen when he speaks, but saying that it was just unacceptable, etc. From a sort of Jungian sort of inverted commas standpoint, I see the trickster figure at work.
Truly.
And I think Trump is a trickster figure. And when I was on the when I did a presentation a few months back, I did broach the topic. Trump is a trickster name. I also said that Donald is potentially a trickster name, but it's keep reminding me he's also named Donald.
Donald.
But it is.
Well, there's balance. There's balance.
But Trump is definitely a trickster name, and he's trumping.
Just like in Bridge or 42, right?
He gives the impression of something, and and he's about something else. And but what is interesting, I find, is that it does come. I mean, it is a signal that maybe the unconscious needs to be balanced out on the social level.
Right. Well, yeah, surely it needs to be balanced out.
Yeah,
and
I'll just finish with a couple of sentences. But,
yeah.
And when the unconscious comes up with this kind of needs, it usually does it in a very sort of childish, barbaric, and very, very elementary fashion. It's never anything very sophisticated. I mean, when the trickster comes up, it's usually a lot of rubbish, But it has its purpose.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, he's a very bad trickster figure. Okay, and I don't mean that in he's a bad
sloppy
person.
He's
he's very poor because
Hitler. I mean, to me, Hitler is also a trickster figure.
Surely,
but there was discipline, focus, and consistency, and
right.
This has no discipline, focus, or consistency. It has a lot of the discipline of I'm going to smoke the narcotic of hope and say all these things and hope that everyone else comes to the rescue. I mean, it
yeah, and I call them lost boys. The lost boys have no clue what their fellow Americans actually think, and
I saw a comment several weeks ago that Lost Boys, just to clarify, you mean from like Peter Pan, not like from the Lost Boys being the vampires, the movie. So the Peter Pan haven't grown up, Lost Boys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These guys haven't grown up, and maybe they're the result of 50 years of 50% divorce rate, where young men haven't had father figures.
But tens of millions of Americans still voted for him.
Well, that's right. Over 70 million voted for him. But I mean, but that's a psychic epidemic.
Mm-hmm.
And if you wake them up, if they get awakened, which they did last week, because Dr. Jung was commenting even 100 years ago when he was writing the Red Book that human nature doesn't change without blood. And now we've had blood sacrifice. We've had one demonstrator and one police officer who have died.
I think 4 people died. Yeah.
Yeah,
Or-
but 2 or 3 of them died from natural causes. Okay, they
Ah.
had a heart attack or
Okay.
something, so that wouldn't be sufficient. But where people die by violence, that's how human beings get awakened. They see blood, they see death, they see misery, and they see the jokers that were in the Capitol. Who could
Well,
take
and
them
the death
seriously?
wakes up the life. I mean, they find life in death because it's like a geode. The death cracks open, and oh wait, this life's not so bad. I should probably get on with it.
Yeah, pay attention.
Yeah, pay attention.
Grow up, and so I'm not saying there won't be demonstrations on January 17th or 20th. There probably will be, at least small ones, but they're going to come to the same end. And if there are another 100 people killed, there, unfortunately, that's the cost of liberty. And
And when you say grow up, there's also the grow up and grow down, because the roots of your stance are going to be so important. What is it? Jung said, a tree cannot grow to heaven unless its roots grow to hell. I mean,
yeah,
it's a cantilever, and you have to have the structural support for balance below as much as you do above. So, if someone says grow up, and there's an implication that they had a foundation.
yeah. So Manuela has said, maybe, as Skip one day said, Trump represents the shadow of a society that is problem facing some issues. Absolutely. And
Yes.
Rocket King says, yeah, in the U.S., we're largely used to seeing this level of political upheaval as a foreign phenomenon. So this is quite humbling. Yeah, and so we're bringing up into consciousness now the American shadow, which is what those people represented. But would you want any of those people that were in the Capitol as the mayor of your city? Come on, give me a break. No.
Well, and the memes are priceless with the horns and the fur and the taxidermy. But then he made the cover of GQAnon. I mean, it's so.
All right, so he's now been seen,
And that's it. 15 minutes over.
Right, and now one part of psychology, especially for people that don't have a full grip on life, is that they want to be seen. Okay, so now these guys have been seen, but oh, by the way, now you're going to spend 2 to 5 years in prison.
See, you're going to see bars, right?
Yeah,
now you're going to see bars.
Yeah, and some of you are going to jail for life for murder, and so so when I say on Sunday mornings it's 8 o'clock in the East, do you know where your children are? Do you know where your husbands and brothers are? Really, and let's pay attention to them, because in fairness, and Nicole brought up recently that there have been lots of unfair attacks on men and on manhood, and I see that in our society where recently on one of our Mark of the Self sessions that we did with Colleen Kibert, there were a bunch of people pounding on men, and I took umbrage to that. I said, "No, wait a minute. These people are my fellow Americans, and when I was in the Marine Corps, those men were standing shoulder to shoulder with me in foxholes, and and we never talked politics in the Marine Corps, and we don't in the Army or the Navy either, because it's verboten. It's against the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is exactly why General McChrystal got removed from his command a few years ago by Barack Obama. It's against the Uniform Code of Military Justice to talk about politics in the military, and if you do it, you're going to get thrown out or you're going to go to jail.
Well, the phalanx is composed of phalanx parts, and each one has a common drive and vision.
Yeah. So Max here says, what do you expect to happen when jobs have been slowly disappearing for the past 40 years? I saw this coming long ago. This is what Occupy March was all about. We are experiencing the effects of globalism. Yes, I agree with you entirely. Okay. In other words, things are not hunky-dory in the United States. And the reason is because a group of very greedy people, mostly in Wall Street, but to a lesser extent in Washington, and certainly a lot of Washington politicians have pulled all the value to themselves. So, like the top 1% or the top 1/10 of 1% of American people control over 50% of the wealth now, and
that actually increased over the pandemic.
Right, exactly, and every time there's a crisis, they use that crisis politically to draw money into themselves. So when there was when the crash of 2008 occurred, they got paid double on all defaulted mortgages. They got paid through the TARP to $450 billion. So all those mortgages were actually paid off, and then they went and took people's homes too. Okay, so they got paid double, and it happened to me, and I agree that that's not right. I fought a lawsuit about it for 9 years because of that. Personally, I fought that lawsuit single-handedly to include 5 trips to the Court of Appeals in Maryland and once to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in the fullness of time, I realized that I never could succeed, even though I was right. And that had happened, and you can't be paid twice on a debt. The courts had to leave it go because of the fraud was so vast that it applied to every county courthouse in the country. And
your example too is so indicative of insurance compensation. For example, you make a claim, they pay you, they turn around and they sue their casualty company who pays them, who then sues their casualty company to pay. It never ends. Yeah. And so you get the funny money after the first payment, which makes the first payment kind of funny money in a way.
Right. So the powers that be took at least $1 trillion out of the economy and to themselves in the crash of 2008. And now in the pandemic, they've taken another $2 trillion out because, now my wife and I got $1,200 for our trouble with the pandemic, and we got, I think, $600 before or something like that. But you add it up for the number of people that got paid, and it's chump change compared to the amount of money that the wealthy, greedy ones took out of the economy. And so they have a problem now. They have a big problem, which is they're richer than Midas, and they know how to touch everything and it turns to gold. Well, it doesn't turn to gold. It turns into little green electrons in Swiss banks. But those little green electrons are meaningless unless you can invest in something. And they've basically destroyed the middle class economy. So what's there to invest in anymore?
And those stimulus checks are flashes in the pan while they tap into the maple tree and have a continuous run of syrup.
That's right. And so the the people who were protesting in Washington last week were not wrong. Okay, they're not wrong, because as Max here has said, we've had all of our jobs ripped off, and we've just been treated like dirt by the powers that be, and that has to change. And but what is wrong is not communism or socialism in the lower classes. It's communism and socialism in the upper classes, where they want to privatize profit and socialize risk, so that so that so they're the biggest socialists at all. So whenever a politician says that person is a socialist, you can be sure that that politician is exactly. And Donald Trump has done it very openly. Every time he complains about somebody else, it's normally about something that he's been doing.
Well, and it's this dyslexic projection, I call it. When you finally learn how to listen for it, and you realize you have a sense of yourself or your community or your family or your country, and someone says something, there's not even a not so much. There's a, wow, you're so astute and self-aware. I don't think I've ever heard someone describe themselves so clearly, because it's a direct confession.
Yeah. Daniel says, as long as people project their shadow on those on the other side, tension will increase. Jung foresaw this. I honestly don't think it will turn out well at first. Perhaps we humans are more of a hive mentality than we fully realize. We are evoking, perhaps, and this is Max, we're evolving perhaps, and it is painful. Richard Dolan has some well-developed ideas on the subject. Daniel says, what we saw the other day was the mass man. No individual was present there. That's right. It's a psychic epidemic in society.
Mm-hmm.
And
standing on a diving board, asking your mom to watch you dive when you're 4.
right.
I mean,
yeah,
Mom, look. It's like they're heads behind the paper, and finally their eyes, but
yeah. So let's see.
It's collective psychosis.
Yeah, it is.
Yes.
And Manuela says, I agree. Sad, perhaps, because families and society split because they're being used by politicians for their own gain, with the aid of TV and social media. Absolutely. That's what's happening. Okay, now let's go back to Ferrer, because I want to get through these 2 pages today. Okay, so after all, traditions do understand each other and frequently developed and transformed themselves through rich and varied interreligious interactions. So they have been taking good ideas from one another, for thousands of years. All the faith traditions have done that, and they do understand what the other is doing. Okay, the strict incommensurability of traditions needs to be rejected on logical, pragmatic, and historical grounds. In other words, the strict rule that my religion is right and yours is wrong, we have to get over that. Okay, and we have to find a way to stop talking like that, because we're just killing our fellow men, and that doesn't help anything. And so we have to wake up. And thus it may be possible to talk about a common spiritual dynamism underlying the plurality of religious insights and ultimates. So in other words, there is a common spiritual dynamism, but it's present in all religions, and it's, as Jordan and I well know, it's also present in the Tarot, and all kinds of other esoteric traditions. it's present in astrology. And Carl Sagan, before he died, was railing against witches in the woods, and the fact that there were 3,000 columns on astrology in the world's newspapers, but none on astronomy. And there's reason for that. Okay, there's a spiritual reason for that. And unfortunately, Carl Sagan didn't live long enough to understand that. And
it's interesting that at that point, late in life, he was railing against origin, because those witches in the woods, one day back in ancient culture, looked up and said, I've seen that in the sky before. Let me write that down. And then they began the path towards tables and charts. And then now we have the ephemeris and then the astronomical orbits, et cetera, et cetera. But there's just that one little drop of dye in the witches in the forest, so to speak. And then that spread out to become what he did. Right. I mean, it's...
Okay, and what I want to do here is pull out a link for everyone, because I wrote on this some time ago, and that is an article that I did back, I don't know, 5 years ago or something, called Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson Missed an Entire Universe. And I've since recanted, and I'm just looking for the link here, but I've recanted because they've actually missed 7.5 billion universes. They didn't miss one. Right, because each of us has a universe within us, and that's what Carl Jung was getting at. And so I'll put it for the panelists. I'll put it in the chat here. There's the link, and for the YouTube audience, I will put it in the YouTube. Oh, wait a minute, it's too big to go on the YouTube chat, so let me get that out of there. And here's the link for YouTube. All right, and the reason that this link is interesting is that about halfway down in the article, I included a quote from, or actually an interview with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he is talking about dark matter and dark energy, and it's hilarious because he's talking about it like a seance. So he's commonly railing against things that are not in the logos, not in structure, and yet his description of dark energy and dark matter is exactly that, and he talks about it like someone would talk about a seance. So it's really, in a way, quite funny and sad. All right, but reading on now. But let us be clear here. This spiritual universalism does not say that the Tao is God, that emptiness, sunyata, is structurally equivalent to Brahman, and similar, quite empty, I believe, equations. And neither does it suggest that equally problematic possibility that these spiritual elements are different cuts, layers, or snapshots of the same pie. As I see it, the indeterminable nature of spirit cannot be adequately depicted through any positive attribute, such a non-dual, dual, impersonal, personal, and so forth, such as those dichotomies, Manichaeism. This is why I believe so many Western and Eastern mystics chose the so-called via negativa, okay, or apophatic language to talk about the divine, and why each non-experiential language was regarded at, and why such non-experiential language was regarded by most traditions as closer to the divine than any positive statement of its qualities. And so anyway, from Ferrer's point of view, we're all right and we're all wrong, I guess, is more or less it. Okay, so going on, spiritual universalism of the participatory vision then does not establish any a priori hierarchy of positive attributes of the divine. In other words, Becca Tarnas was calling about the elephant and the idea that all religions have a piece of the elephant, the trunk, the tail, or the legs. And Ferrer says, but there's no elephant. And that's the point, that there's no attribute that has to be there in order to give one a spiritual sense or a spiritual experience.
And that speaks to the a priori, which it's not something that's fully developed that just comes like an air conditioner or CD in your car package. I mean, it's something that has to grow,
Right.
And that growth comes from influence.
Right. And so non-dual insights are not necessarily higher than dual, nor are dual higher than non-dual. Personal inactions are not necessarily higher than impersonal, nor impersonal higher than personal, and so forth. Since the mystery is intrinsically indeterminate, spiritual qualitative distinctions cannot be made by matching our insights and conceptualizations with any pre-given features. In contrast, I suggest that qualitative distinctions among spiritual inactions can be made by not only evaluating their emancipatory power for self relationships and world, but also discriminating how grounded in or coherent with mystery they are. And so I would simply say, when I'm making an omelet in the morning and I'm connecting with my creative power to make that omelet, that's as legitimate a way of connecting with myself as, somebody who's covered themselves with ashes and crawling through a bed of nails, whatever.
Your omelet is a discipline of the ritual of prayer. I mean, it's
Exactly.
daily, same time, same bat channel, and that's prayer. There's a place where you stop, drop, and you connect.
Right. Okay.
And then you get to eat. That's a bonus. I mean,
right. That is a bonus. Okay. but
which means you can do it again tomorrow.
Right. But that's a logos bonus. And that's why we have to have logos and eros interact. Okay. Because creating the omelet is following a procedure, maybe not so strict procedure, but a creative act that creates something that's manifest, that's a physical thing, an omelet. But that omelet feeds my consciousness and my wife's consciousness. Okay. And it keeps us there. And that's the unique thing that the human being has that other animals don't have, is self-awareness, and that is ineffable. Okay, you can't explain why you're conscious. And so anyway, moreover, because of their unique psychospiritual and archetypal dispositions, individuals and cultures may emancipate themselves better through different enactions of the spiritual power. And this not only paves the way for a more constructive and enriching interreligious dialogue, but also opens up the creative range of valid spiritual choices potentially available to us as individuals. Now he's got the following in italics. In sum, this vision brings forth a more relaxed and permissive spiritual universalism that passionately embraces rather than reduces, conflates, or subordinates the variety of ways in which the sacred can be cultivated and embodied without falling into spiritual anarchy or vulgar relativism. So the point is that well, there's a terrific book that is hard to find now because it went out of print. I think it may be coming back. It's a book called Sacred Chaos, and it's by a woman named Françoise O'Kane. And I urge you to try to find it in used books if you can't find it on Amazon. But the point is that the sacred, chaos, the sacred, and our lives all exist in the eros. They do not exist in the logos. And this is the fundamental issue that at least Protestant pastors and priests have, and Catholic priests have been getting wrong for thousands of years. And that is that the key message of the book of John is not that God is a word. And, I was struggling with that for years and years and years. And finally, when I was doing my talk called Finding the Living God, I finally got it. And the way I got it was I said, okay, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay, so I went back to in the beginning, and I said, didn't something happen since the beginning? Isn't there something more? I mean, I don't think God is a word. I think a Bible is a black doorstop unless somebody puts life into it. And so I said, so didn't something happen since the beginning? So I committed myself to reading further in the book of John. And oh my God, the answer comes 3 verses later, verses John 1, 4, and 5, and where it says, he was the light and the life, okay, talking about Christ. And that's the point, okay, because Christ was talking about something other than the word, okay, he was the experience, and as Jung would put it, he was a symbol of the self. He was allowing the self to come forward, and so we have to get beyond words because words are logos. All right, so all my words are logos. I admit it. Okay, so last page here. The relationship between pluralism and universalism cannot be characterized consistently in a hierarchical fashion, and even less in terms of spiritual evolution. While there are lower and higher forms of both universalism and pluralism, more or less emancipatory, grounded in the mystery, sophisticated, encompassing, explanatory, etc., my sense is that the dialectic between universalism and pluralism, between the one and the many, displays what may well be the deepest dynamics of the self-disclosing of the spirit. That it's both. In other words, the spirit manifests in both universalism and pluralism, is what he's saying. And that's the paradox, but nonetheless, if we understand that it is a paradox, that's part of the mystery, and therefore we have to live with it. We
Well,
are the bridge. The human being is the bridge.
And then add the vulgar relativism. Trauma doesn't need an adjective. Truth has no use of adjectives. It's not relative. So there's an allusion to the collective unconscious, but also to the individual experience of said collective unconscious. So that puts then 1, 2, 3 rounds the troops all together.
Right. Okay, so from the rigid universalism of rational consciousness to the pluralistic relativism of some postmodern approaches, from perennialist universalisms to the emerging spiritual pluralism of the interfaith dialogue, spirit seems to swing from one to the other pole, from the one to the many, and from the many to the one, endlessly striving to more fully manifest, embody, and embrace love and wisdom in all of its forms. Newer and more embracing universalist and pluralistic visions will continue to emerge, but the everlasting dialectical movement between the one and the many in the self-disclosing of spirit makes any abstract or absolute hierarchical arrangement between them misleading. Okay, and this is a chop at Ken Wilber, and this is why he got into controversy after this book, because Ken Wilber is the ultimate reductionist who had seen the transpersonal and shown that they're all the same, but it's misleading to think that you can get there. It's fundamentally it's the controversy between Freud and Jung, okay, which was Freud wanted to reduce everything to materialistic terms, and Jung said, no, there's something more here, and that's what we have to get at. And this is why Paul Vanderklay, who's this famous pastor on YouTube now, has a hard time getting his mind around the fact that Jordan Peterson is not a Jungian, okay? Because Peterson very often will drop Jung's name, okay? He does talk about a lot of things that relate to Jungian ideas, but he considers himself the savior of the logos. And the point is that the logos can only take you so far. And in the end, the logos is dead. Okay. In other words, everything that we have in our rooms, everything that we can see in Jordan's picture or David's picture, except the human beings, we need the logos to produce those. We need the logos to produce David's eyeglasses and his sweater. We need the logos to produce the images behind Jordan or Jordan's headset. We need the logos 100% and perfect in order to produce any product, my shirt, whatever it is. And this building behind me, Bollingen, is Jung's confession of faith in stone. Okay, and what was he confessing? He was confessing that creation is where the spirit is. Okay, and so all of his life, he was creating something without fail. Okay, if you go back through the work of C.G. Jung, what you find is a trail going back all the way to his young youth of images that he was creating, quite profound images in many ways, and going right along, whether he did it in painting, in writing, in stonemasonry, whatever, he was constantly creating. And when he said, and I wondered about this for years, I said, what the heck is he talking about, my confession of faith in stone? And the confession of faith, the point is that he was always creating. Mm-hmm. And that is logos now, okay? It's a house. It's a building, and it's really not a very good house in modern terms because it has no plumbing in it and it has no electricity in it. It's basically a stonemasonry structure. And when you went to it, you were basically camping out. He said the only thing that would seem out of place to a 16th century man in his building was the matches. Everything else was already being built in the 16th century. And so the point is that he was performing that, but by doing something creative, you make a connection with the self, with the spirit. And so he only did what his spirit required him to do. And he said that several times. And so, for example, Answer to Job, which is one of his most profound works, he wrote in 10 days and in a fever. And it was only when after he completed it that the fever broke. And so he was forced by himself to do that. And now you can go back and you can look at this YouTube channel, and that's my confession of faith. And it's not in stone, it's in electrons, but the point is that something in me has forced me to produce over 1,100 videos about Carl Jung's work, and keeps me doing it 3 or 4 times a week. And so that's the point. Okay, it's not that any of it is so special. It's definitely imperfect. Okay, but
and he literally dwelled in a time before 16th century, 14th century alchemists in a way where the assumption of electricity. So in a sense, he didn't have to inspect his expectations born of basically delegated to the servant of power. His life had to make those things happen if it was going to happen. And so he lived congruently with those times. And I find what's interesting about that naturalism, as it were, when Ferrer mentions the perennial universalism, I mean, me as a gardener, a perennial naturalizes, and it pops up in different spots in the garden, like an aspen forest sends out shoots, and here come more trees over here. It's the same plant, except in a different spot. So it has different influences driving it. So almost like I love it when he says the perennial universalism, because it's almost like he's calling it a weed. It just pops up everywhere.
Sure. That's right. And so, okay, so one and the many and the self-disclosing of spirit makes any abstract or absolute hierarchical arrangement between them misleading. If I am right about the generative power of the dialectical relationship between the one and the many, then to get stuck in or freeze either of the two poles as the truth cannot but hinder the natural unfolding of the spirit's creative urges. So in other words, if we get stuck in either the one or the many, we're stopping evolution. And that's what did happen and does happen in every religion, because remember, every religion isn't about the spirit, it's about the structure to talk about the spirit. And once it becomes structure to talk about the spirit, then, oh, by the way, it's a rice bowl for the ministers and pastors, right? They use it as a way to support themselves and get their churches built and all that jazz. But that's only peripherally about the spirit. And
well, if you look at religion, the structure of religion you're referring to as a musical instrument, particularly say a saxophone, a trumpet, or a flute, the way the air passes through it sounds a certain way, but it will sound a certain. If I blast a trumpet, it's not a flute, it's not a saxophone, but it's still the same air going through it, making the music. And there's the spiritual structure metaphor.
Right. Well, and very simply, the term you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make him drink.
Yes.
So, in other words, what religions were ways to bring people to the spiritual, and many people, started to have spiritual experiences because of being brought to the water of spirituality through religious structure, through the logos. But that's what the problem of John 1:1 is, which is you can bring somebody to a religious perspective to make them understand their spirit, perhaps, but you can't force them to drink and to have the spiritual experience, which is what my talk. Oleg was kind enough to refer to my talk that I gave back in October of 2019, which is called "Finding the Living God," because how there is a living God. There's no doubt about that in my mind, not in the least bit. And the problem is that we have to find it. Religions are ways to find it, or to find God, but they're not the only ways. And so that's why I do these talks. And so that's why the synchronicity now, you're going to hear my synchronicity about this book that I'm reading that Tim gave me, which he calls Storm Stories, a cautionary tale. The significance of that is that right there is a synchronicity not only between this book, which is 109 years old, and the events of last Wednesday, but they're also a synchronicity between a 109-year-old book and what Ferrer is saying. That's the point. And I'm going to read another poem from there in a minute. But
can I just intervene quickly, Skip?
Sure.
Well, what you said about religion, it's also possible to see it the other way, in the sense that, at least in Europe, religion, Christianity, shaped Europe.
Surely, no doubt.
Socially, economically, and in a way, if one says, well, the problem is the unconscious, I think that everybody can agree with that, because we have no idea what it is and how it works. And then we find ways to sort of organize our conscious life that will take into account the impossibility of organizing the unconscious. So religion gives the opportunity for societies, for people, to organize a conscious life.
Right, exactly.
So they can function on the conscious level.
Right. So you can bring people to water. You can bring people to believe that democracy is alive and well in the United States, but you can't make them drink about that. And so, last Wednesday was an example of people who haven't understood what democracy is, and so therefore they think by violence they have a solution, which is not the case, okay? Because violence like that is always going to be put down. I mean, no matter if they killed every congressperson in the building, we would just go out and elect new congresspeople. And
to set the hook in Ken Wilber's reductionism, or just reductionism in general, which is kind of like trying to catch Jello. But the reality is, Frank Lloyd Wright would say, "Why don't you enter competitions?" And he would ask that, and he would say, "Well, first they take out the high, and then they take out the low, and then they make the average of the average, and that's not where I live." And so you could bring a horse to drink, but then the philosopher walks up and says, "But drink the water." And the horse says, "Well, that's not how I take my tea." So it's like, your water is not my water, even though it's evidently water. And I think Ken Wilber's reductionism is trying to say, well, isn't water the same thing for everyone? And
right.
So to speak.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. I'll give you an architectural metaphor. And speaking of Frank Lloyd Wright, since you brought that up, Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, you build a building to withstand the forces of nature, right? And so Frank Lloyd Wright built in Tokyo the first cantilevered building called the Imperial Hotel, which is right across the moat from the Imperial Palace in Tokyo.
Mm-hmm.
And in 1923, at noon on a certain date in 1923, whatever the date of the Great Tokyo earthquake was, I don't remember that date per se, but it was the date of the Great Tokyo earthquake. And at noon on that date is when the earthquake occurred. And after the earthquake was over, the only building left standing in Tokyo was the Imperial Hotel. Mm-hmm. And the point of that was that Frank Lloyd Wright built it to withstand the exigencies of having a building on the planet Earth, and he recognized that there were earthquakes in Tokyo, and so
this even worse.
He built it to withstand by giving. It gave. It lives, and so when there's an earthquake, it's not rigid. Okay, I mean Jung's house here. If there was an earthquake there, right, that would collapse, no doubt. Okay. Right. But Frank Lloyd Wright's building didn't collapse because he built give in it. So
let me add something to that. No one else would have built there. It was on a bog. I mean, how are you going to build? And it's not going to. We don't want to build a houseboat, but we're going to build on a bog. So first, he has this very thick foundation, like a pad, a lily pad, and the cantilever is a vertical columnar structure, one giant big piece. And the whole building is a scale that just balances on the top. Well, he literally took the idea of a strong base to hold your vertical piece, and let's weigh the gold. And in that earthquake, that building just did this. Not a single masonry tile popped or cracked. And what killed that building was actually successive remodels, manhandling modern HVAC and air conditioning kind of thing, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, electricity. But that building doing this during an earthquake, and then it slowly came to the stop stasis. So structurally, it was so simple. But that's one of my favorite cross sections of how to withstand forces. Is like you said, it gave and it actually danced. It harmonized with what was occurring seismically under it and to it. And it reminds me just actually of structural engineering. Stress is kind of a myth. Stress is just a force applied, but strain is when permanent deformation occurs, bending, flexure, cracking, and then the strain being it doesn't come back and remember the form. So even from a psychological standpoint, that Imperial Hotel stress and strain are a wonderful example you're bringing up there. And it just kind of circles itself. It keeps it's almost an inexhaustible resource for psychology. I think just that building.
It's very interesting because I can't cite my sources because it's too long ago, but the understanding for the Japanese when there was an earthquake was that there's a huge salamander nesting down deep below, and that salamander or some kind of animal that shape, but very large one, wasn't happy with what was going on. So it would kind of move about, and then the whole island.
Right. So now, of course,
there you go.
Now,
I love that story.
Buildings in Tokyo now do followed Frank Lloyd Wright's vision. And so if you're on the 60th floor of a building when there's a big earthquake in Tokyo, and that happens quite often. I mean, once every 3 weeks, you have a level 4 or 5 earthquake in Japan. And so if you're up on the 60th floor, whoa, man, you're going, woo, over here, and then over here. It's like being on a fun house.
Well, when you're in the bathroom and you look over and you wonder, why am I feeling a little off balance? And you notice the water sloshing out of the toilet. You get a sense, a frame of reference for, oh, I'm in motion.
Yeah, and even the home. I lived in a house which was sort of a standard 1,500 square foot house in Tokyo, two-story house. An L-shaped living room, dining room area, three-bedroom home. And what was interesting is even that house gave, and so the only way you could tell that there was an earthquake going on was that the pictures on the walls were moving. And so anyway, so we have to learn a little bit of plasticity, let's say, in our spiritual life. Okay, so anyway, here we go. This is why, although originally offered in a different context, the following remark by Habermas, 1992, seems pertinent here. Quote, "The metaphysical priority of unity above plurality and the contextualist priority of pluralism above unity are secret accomplices." So in other words, it is a dialectic. There is an earthquake going back between the two of them, but we have to keep standing regardless of both. Okay, so to conclude, last 7 sentences of this book. To conclude, I would like to emphasize that it is only after traveling through the tremendously rich, complex, and multifaceted spiritual waters that we can, I believe, afford to immerse ourselves in the profound ocean of this more open, fertile, and relaxed universalism, a universalism that calls to be realized not so much in isolated individual inner experiences, grandiose visions, or metaphysical intuitions, but through intimate dialogue and communion with other beings and the world. Okay, I'll read that sentence again. Well, I'll read half of the sentence again. Not so much in isolated individual inner experiences, grandiose visions, or metaphysical intuitions, but through intimate dialogue and communion with other beings and the world. Okay, so
You brought up an important word there. I mean, that goes across professions. I mean, plasticity. I mean, most people have heard of neuroplasticity and the way the brain rehardwires, but then go back to architecture, plasticity of soils and geotechnical work. And for example, if I look at a plasticity index in a soils report and I see a number 37%, it's like, whoa, expansive, hot soils. You literally have a slow moving underground ocean. So just the bracing of how a foundation has to then be amplified to withstand those forces and stay in a place instead of getting moved across the job site or undermined where its structure is just ripped out from under it. And as well, then taking the plasticity example of soils, of how much can we take or how much support do we need? A lot of soils reports, when they do their boring holes, won't find bedrock.
right.
And so what happens is you drill to 20,000 PSI torsional resistance. It's just the auger going down has to achieve that much skin friction all the way down to be a stable pylon, or to failure, or 3 feet past bedrock. And what I find interesting is that 3 feet past bedrock, that's a solid place. But hanging out here in space, 20,000 PSI torsional resistance, that equates to a solid footing. So you can't see the footing. It's just they're distributed across that which is connected to. And I think that has, that's an example of those things we can't see, but we do understand the forces we brace against.
Right. So Jordan is now talking about the synchronicity. He doesn't know it yet, but he's talking about the synchronicity.
Go figure.
With this 109-year-old book that Tim Holmes gave me for Christmas. And keep in mind what happened in the halls of Congress last Wednesday. And so this is, I'm still reading from the eulogy of Charles Quincy Terrell that was given by Mr. Hawley of Oregon. And I'm at the end of it, and I'm just going to read the last page because it's so, and by the way, I did read this straight out yesterday because I'm reading this book on the YouTube channel, and I've read 4 parts so far, but this is the part that I read yesterday. And so I want you to think about what Jordan was just saying about the pylon, about the halls of Congress, and about humanity itself and spiritual. And here's what Mr. Hawley said. Man, as it was said once before in the halls of Congress, is the center of a circle whose fatal circumference he cannot pass. Within its confines, he is omnipotent, but outside of it, he perishes. And if any human life, even the longest and most fortunate, is not supplanted hereafter by a fuller life, then we are all creatures the most miserable. And those who fear to die should dread to live, for life would be a tragedy more dark and inexplicable than death. Quote, what a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel, in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world. Such men as he, whose solemn memory we commemorate today, lead us in the words of the great singer to this. There is a God who lives and loves, one God, one law, one element, and one far off divine event to which the whole creation moves. So that's it.
Amen.
Amen. Any comments?
Amen.
Yeah. Nothing much more to say.
No, that's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I have completed what I was going to say about Ferrer's 2002 book. We are going to be talking with Dr. Ferrer himself on the 7th of February at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. Dr. Ferrer lives in Ibiza, Spain, so it will be 7 p.m. for him. And I urge you to come and hear what he has to say. And let's see, I guess now's a good time to put up our link so that everybody can find us. So I guess I'll do that. So I'm putting onto the YouTube channel the link to our sessions so that you can get notified of our sessions on a regular basis. And I think David and Yuan both have that already. And so I hope you'll join us on the 7th of February. I also hope that this afternoon at 1 p.m., my wife, Deborah McLaughlin, is going to speak about the vanishing path. Now, Debbie is quite a unique individual. I've been married to her for 35 years. And so I have had the benefit of her wisdom for all of that time. And everybody that I ever met that had met Debbie knows that she is a profound individual. You've met people who are smart. Debbie is smart. She's a Phi Beta Kappa from Connecticut College, among other things, and she holds an MA in Japanese sociolinguistics. But and she and I met, among other things, because of our common interest in Japan. But we are, and I have made this assertion probably several hundred times in the last 30 years, and nobody has ever doubted it. We are the first couple to meet online and marry. And we met because of our common interests online in Japan. And we met on August the 22nd, 1985. And so if you know of anybody that met earlier than that and married the person they met, then please let me know. But I don't think you will find such a person. So, so Debbie and I met online and on August the 22nd, 1985. That's the record date. And we physically met on August the 29th, 1985. And 4 months later, I left my wife of 17 years and my 3 daughters and went to live with Debbie. And I've never looked back. And so
what was the second date, the date you actually physically met?
August the 29th, 1985. Okay. And keeping in mind that.
So 1 week, 22nd to then 29th.
Right.
Okay.
So, and we lived at the time 400 miles apart. Okay. So.
Stone's throw in Texas.
Yeah. So, and I literally flew to meet Debbie. That wasn't the only reason I was traveling. But anyway, the World Wide Web, which is what we all rely on now, didn't get started until 1995 commercially. It existed in very rudimentary form before that, and it was an email network. There were email networks, which is how we met. But the World Wide Web itself, which is what the world relies on today, didn't get going until 1995. So I met her 10 years before that.
And I think you won't get much competition for those dates. I just thought about it, thinking back to the VAX in college, when all of a sudden there's this magical thing, and in Lubbock I can type and talk to someone in Austin immediately. But that was 1989.
Yeah.
And it had only been there since 1986, and it wasn't available for everybody. And only because I knew someone in the computer lab, and I was president of the American Institute of Architecture students. He's like, "Hey, come check something out." Well, that's kind of like student security clearance. No one else knew what that room was. They just always knew it was locked with glass doors. Why is everyone so happy when they're typing? And they didn't know that. Well, because we're talking to people who aren't here instantly. So
right.
I can. So
right. And David has left, but David was on this whole session from Paris today. And
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And now we can see each other too. I mean,
right.
So
we can see each other, and it's free, basically.
So Debbie McLaughlin, your wife, it's 1 o'clock today.
So she's going to be talking about the vanishing path, and she's it's a spiritual discussion. But Debbie has been involved with religion all of her life. She was a Northern Baptist, and then she went to Japan and got involved with Japanese religions. And in 1994, I was traveling in the Far East, and I received a fax from Debbie, and it said, I found the book that if I was trapped on a desert island and had no other book, this is the book I would want to have. And the book was the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying.
Yeah.
And by Sojo Rinpoche. And so I came back and we went to a number of retreats together, Buddhist retreats. And I had Buddhism in my life since I was 15, since I moved to Kamakura, Japan, and lived a mile from the great Buddha of Kamakura for 3 years. And so Debbie followed Buddhism. She took it's customary for somebody who's going to be ordained in Buddhism to do a 3-year retreat. Mm-hmm. And Sojo Rinpoche offered a home retreat in 7 years. And so Debbie did the 7-year home retreat. And so she basically has completed the equivalent of ordination training in Buddhism, in Tibetan Buddhism. However, Sojo Rinpoche did some pretty dastardly things late in his life. He's now dead. And as a result of that, his work kind of collapsed. And so Debbie has had to find her own path, as we all do. And so her talk this afternoon is about the vanishing path and about how we all have to find a spiritual path and before death. And so Debbie now works for a hospice in the Washington area. And she volunteers at the hospice as a vigil volunteer, which means that she goes to the hospice to the people who are closest to dying and sits with them quite simply. And many people who are near death often are quite lonely because their families are even afraid of being near them. And, they come and they say goodbye, but then they leave. And so then there are nurses and doctors around and tubes and things. But,
I'm so looking forward to the Vanishing Path presentation by Debbie today. Designing a hospice facility, collaborating with another individual early in my career, I think was one of the most powerful architectural experiences ever, because there came a point where I vigil design became the person. And all of a sudden they're like, why does this building look just so simple? Where's the feast for the eyes? And I'm like, the feast for the eyes? I put all the architecture in the ceiling because that's their experience. So I literally turned the axis and changed the perspective, because to me at that point, they were having such powerful experiences in silence when someone was there, and such torrential experiences in loneliness when people weren't. And I remember the quote that kind of kicked me off and was the old Irish proverb of "May the ground always rise to support your every step," to which I added, especially when there's nothing there when you started stepping. And at that point, I literally remember putting down everything and getting out of my desk, and I lied down on the floor. And I'm like, hand me my crayon. And so I was trying, I was like, my shoulders got stronger because I did everything lying down, because I didn't have that perspective. But After
that's literally what the vanishing path is about.
I'm
right.
so looking forward to today because I've never actually had other than one other conversation. So I'm going to love it. I feel like I'm going to go to the IMAX theater Debbie's playing, because it's like, this is big stuff.
Yeah. So, so a couple of other things about Debbie. She took a 1-year course on companioning the dying, and she took another 1-year course on becoming a funeral celebrant. So the image of Debbie that was in the mailing last night that I put out for people who are on the Wisdom Path colloquium, that image of Debbie is Debbie in her stole as a funeral celebrant. And she's not ordained, but about, I think it's 40% of the American population has no spiritual path, no religion that they follow, and so on. And so when they come to death, there's nobody to talk with them and talk with their relatives about their lives and so on. And so that's the role of a funeral celebrant, and
that role is that stat is so important. The 40% don't even have a spiritual path, because even in the bio that you put there, to jump off the mountain, to jump off the ledge, to basically to jump off, you have to have had a spiritual path to jump off from. And when someone says, well, they just need to have a rite of passage, I'm like, all they have is trauma. They never had the long road home after that to come to rite of passage to become to self. So there's a whole piece missing in that 40% from, I guess, as Viktor Frankl put it, there's a space between stimulus and response, and in that space you have a choice, and they never were given that. So what I love about this today is especially you have to live it, you have to have that path, because that's the only way to inform it, and a way to give yourself a launching point, and literally a cornerstone to brace against as you leave.
Yeah. Right. Max says, check out Thomas Merton and the Moral Dilemma. And that makes good sense. I haven't ever read Merton, but I do know something about him, and I think that's probably...
Or The Sevenfold Mountain. I can't remember the title, but...
right.
It's
okay, so anyway, this afternoon... and is Debbie, and on the 30th of January, we will be doing a new doodle with Colleen Kibert, which we're now changing the name of the doodle to Mark of the Self, because in keeping with Jung's comment about his confession of faith in stone, which is behind me here, the confession of faith in the depth of our spiritual nature comes up through creative acts. And so the mark of the self that Colleen is teaching us about is one way of getting into that spiritual aspect of your life through creativity. And you're literally performing an act of God when you're creating. Okay. God created the heavens and the earth. Yep. Okay, fine. But each one of us can create something. And in the image of God, as we are the image of God. And so each one of us can take our little participatory part in that by creating something. And so anyway, on January the 30th, Colleen had selected as the topic, how are you feeling now? And she selected that topic before last Wednesday. And so God knows what will happen between last Wednesday and the 30th of January. But I can imagine that the marks of the self that we will do in preparation for that that moment will be quite interesting, to say the least.
Yeah, to say the least. And I have a deep appreciation for Colleen starting it out with the capital D doodle title. I mean, I knew it was going on, but I went, even for me, I went, ooh. Now, how refreshing is that? Because if I was not an artist or an architect or skilled in drawing, I would be terrified. Well, I'm not an artist. I'm not going to do that. And part of that stuck in cover of I don't want to look at myself. And in a sense, there was a little bit of a, here, I'm going to get a cardboard box and a twig and a string and put some bread under it to catch a bird. Because people will walk right in, but then no one pulls the twig. And you start to discover that first step may be the hardest, but when you pick up a crayon or a pencil and no responsibility, and you start to find out how your hand works and how you work, and then it's just contagious. And then I drop myself back in where I have been for decades, and it's even better. I love the evolution of 3 pieces as a doodle, and then surprise, mark of the self. I mean, I don't think it's any accident. I think she knew what she was doing, but I appreciate the subtle invitation to be inclusive to everyone, regardless of whether they think they can or cannot.
Okay, so tomorrow we have a new follower who calls him or herself Intrepid and says, "Hello from Australia. This is my first time on this chat." And so we do communicate with folks all around the world, and very commonly have people from 4 or 5 continents on our sessions. And tomorrow we will be having our, I guess it's our 22nd session or so, on the Tarot as a roadmap for life. And that session will be on the World card, which is card number 21 in the Major Arcana, which also happens to be about individuation, which is the centerpiece of Dr. Jung's life work. And so I think that will be a very useful and interesting session. And
I have to give a shout out to Intrepid. I like it's a very Sagittarius word, so I'm a little biased, but like intrepid traveler or just intrepid inward outward mover. Great name, Intrepid.
Okay, and I'm just correcting myself because no, I'm wrong again. Australia is
16 hours in the
ahead,
future. Yeah, 16 hours in the future, as I call it. I'm not calling for stock advice, except then there's sleep. Yeah. So
yeah, because we keep changing our time zone, but right now Australia is 16 hours ahead of us. So that session will begin Australian time at noon on Tuesday. So
actually, is it 16? I knew it was 16 when I was in Mountain Time Zone. Is it 13?
No,
I'd have to get my converter.
No.
It is 16.
It's 16 now, and it's 15 when we're on daylight time, I believe. I'm just going to check my world clock, however.
Because I realized I started making that joke that there's 16 hours in the future, not when I lived on the East Coast.
Sydney is 16 hours ahead of us right now. It's 1:50 in the morning, Sydney time. So you're up late. Intrepid, you are up late, I guess. And Manuela is pointing out that she's here from Argentina, and Justin Case is here from Copenhagen. And McD says, isn't it the middle of the night in Australia? And the answer is yes.
Yeah, hour and 15 minutes after people turn into pumpkins.
And he says, the Australian says, thanks, good guess. I'm a sanitarian. Time depends on what state in Australia you are in. Yes, quite so. And so this is, he says he's in lockdown in Brisbane. So I'm not quite sure where Brisbane's time zone is, but anyway, for Sydney, it's going to be noon on Tuesday. And anyway, we are done, I think, and I'm going to have to think about what we're going to talk about next week. It might be Ferrer's newer book, but I'll have to think about that. And it partially may relate to what the events are of the coming week in the United States.
I don't think that'd be a digression at all. In fact, it's actually pretty astute and apt.
Yeah.
Timely.
Okay. So anyway, this afternoon, my voice is gone. So fortunately, Deb's going to do all the talking this afternoon. And I'll see everybody at 1 o'clock, hopefully.